Hi, welcome to valuationpodcast.com, a podcast and video series about all things related to business and valuation. My name is Melissa Gragg, and I provide online divorce, valuation, and mediation services in St. Louis, Missouri. Today, we will discuss divorce finances, tracing marital assets and separate property with Beth Garrett and Bob Boyd. Bob Boyd is a family law attorney in Atlanta, Georgia, and co-founder of Boyd, Collar, Nolen, Tuggle, and Roddenbery. Bob is a leader in family law who has received recognition from his colleagues across Georgia and the nation for his work in high net worth divorce litigation and contested custody cases. Beth Garrett is a lawyer and accountant in Atlanta, Georgia. She's also a partner in the Divorce Litigation Support Practice at Frazier Deeter, primarily assisting high net worth individuals and corporate executives with divorce, tax, and accounting issues. She helps people through mediation and works with divorce lawyers through all financial aspects of litigation and child support matters. She's also a valuation expert and has a credential. Welcome, Beth and Bob. How are you? Well, and I think that a lot of times when I start talking to, spouses, either together or separate, they kind of go into, well, I had this house, I had this boat, I had this 401k, I had this before the marriage. So we just ignore it and we just put it over on the side. We don't need to put any value on it. We don't need to look at anything. Like, that's mine. Go away, right? But that's not really how it works. And so what is actually and we call it tracing assets, right? So probably people haven't heard that term either. But what is involved in tracing the assets, and in, maybe we'll talk about marital contribution as well. But let's just start there. Like, can't I just say, listen, I had this house, I had this account before I was married. We don't have to worry about it. Can we just call it separate? Like, what's wrong with that?
Because it's very, very, very unlikely, and I've never seen this, where you just have this account, I won't say never, and it just hasn't been touched in the entire length of your marriage, that it literally just sat there and grew or didn't grow, just kind of sat there, or the car or the boat or whatever. Now, in some of the short-term marriages, I do have some of that, but in a longer-term marriage, if it's a 401k and a job that you've continued to work in, then you've continued to contribute to it during the marriage, and that's going to commingle it. That's another word that we say all the time. When the reason we have to trace things is because they've been commingled, they've been combined. There's some separate property in the account and there's some marital property. And we see that in retirement. We see that in houses. We see that in investment accounts, most everything. I think that one of the hardest things kind of for people to swallow when we meet with clients is, well, I hear all the time, we kept all of our finances separate. We have all separate accounts. Well, that separate is different than the separate that we're going to start talking about, because you were married, you are married. And so just because it, like Bob was saying earlier, the titling, just like if you jointly title something, it can be in jeopardy. Well, just because you left it in your own name doesn't mean that it's automatically separate. So that's why we do have to look at what happened during the marriage.
Right. And I think that, from a tracing the asset standpoint, from a legal standpoint, Bob, though, like, I'm telling you, it's separate. Why can't you you're my attorney, go tell them that it's separate? Like, what's the problem? I don't see a problem here.
Well, we might tell them it's separate, but if they're not buying that, they're going to hire Beth, and she's going to see all the accounts from the beginning of time, and she's going to show how, with this asset that I came into the marriage with, I started putting 10% of my take-home pay into it every month that I was working, and it's doubled because I've been adding to it during the marriage. And she's going to shake her finger, au contraire, it is not separate property. And, clients don't like it, but that's just when you have to explain this is what the law is. And I wish you would have talked to me earlier about what you're doing with your account.
Well, and I think that that's part of it.
That's one of the
Is
things the prenup can fix.
a prenup.
Yeah, prenup can fix that. If because prenup is probably going to say title controls. So if I've kept an account in my sole name, even if I've added money to it from my earnings during the marriage, it's still going to be my separate property.
Now that's a good point. So let me just break it down, because those are a lot of words that I don't know if people totally understand. But literally, if you like, you could put together a prenup that would say, however these accounts, whatever names these accounts are in, is what's going to control who owns those accounts the life of the marriage.
Mm-hmm.
That is
including
huge.
Appreciation, everything else. That's probably the most common prenup that we do in my office. We call it the title controls prenup.
Okay. I love it. But why is that? Because I think that does get a little confusing with couples, because just like Beth said, well, I have a joint account and I have separate accounts. Beth, from that standpoint, let's go back to I received $100,000 of inheritance. Okay. And I put it in an account with my name prior to marriage, and I invested it. Now, what does it matter? Now that account's $150,000. What does it matter? Because it's mine. It's $150,000. It's all on my side. Why does the difference between income and appreciation matter at all? Like, it should just be 150 is mine. Break it down why that could potentially not be true.
Well, in the situation specifically you described, I would say the 150 is yours, because if it's just sat there, and that's where we talk about active appreciation versus passive appreciation. So your income, if the reason it grew from 100 to 150 is because you were depositing your paycheck into it once a month, or an extra amount from your paycheck, that's active appreciation. Your efforts are the reason that account grew. If it's a stock in a company that just happened to grow, a publicly traded company that you don't have any ownership in, to be very specific, that just happened to grow while you were married, then you had nothing to do with that. And that would be passive appreciation. So dividends that you earn on stock like that continues to be passive. So I'll tell people prenups can be great, and prenups can help with keeping separate property clear. I've also had many cases where people spent all the time and money to draft a prenup and then completely ignored everything it said to do. So I end up tracing all the accounts anyway. So if you have separate property and you put it in an account off to the side, once you get married, you should never add money to that account. You can open a new account, and that's where your marital earnings and your marital savings can go into. But that separate account, as long as you don't add anything to it, it doesn't get commingled. It stays completely separate. You can also spend from that account. You can take money out of it, and that thing in your mind, you're contributing that to the marriage. But it's when you start taking an inheritance that you got, or pre-marriage, it doesn't have to be an inheritance, anything that you had prior to the marriage, and adding to it, that's when you commingle things, and that's when I have to get involved.
And as a footnote to what Beth just said, and it is a great point that comes up all the time. Somebody comes into a marriage with a separate account. They keep it separate. They rock along, and then all of a sudden, somebody needs something. And the best place to get the cash is from this separate account. And so they pull the cash from that separate account, buy the asset, whatever they want to do. It is very common for that person, when they get divorced, to come back and say, hey, I want that money back. I'm entitled to it. That was my separate property. I should get that back. I tell them, that's nice. We can ask, but you're going to lose that argument. I mean, I've tried that issue many times in front of a judge, in front of a jury, and it never wins. I've never seen it win. Let me put it like that.
Well, and let's add one little layer onto that. So we needed $20,000 to buy something, or we needed $20,000 to just cash flow, right? Just pay the bills that month. But the next month I'm going to get a bonus. So I'm going to take that $20,000 bonus and I'm going to put it back into that separate account. Any issues with that?
I think that's nuanced. And I think that's where we start to, the reason we have experts on opposing experts, and we have differing things. There's, I know in Georgia specifically, so when we start to talk about tracing and how we do tracing, there's a couple different ways that you can do it. And we don't have a very clear either statute or case law that says this is how you trace a bank account. So there's several different methods of doing it. And I think there's some that are more accepted than others, but there's not a hard and fast, this is how you do it. So in your example, the most common tracing that I would do is pro rata tracing. So that's where if I have $50 in a bank account that's separate and I add $50 to that bank account, I would then say that that account is 50% separate and 50% marital. If you then spend $50 from it, I would take it out 50% separate and 50% marital. So you don't say obviously I spent all the marital money first and I wouldn't have touched my separate property. Well, then you should have you shouldn't have put them in the same bank account is kind of what we say. But I think there's a specific situation that people would talk about called parking. And I think that, and your example is a little bit the opposite of parking, but I think if you took $20,000 out and 2 days later you put exactly $20,000 back in, if I'm working for that client, I'm going to try to make that argument that yes, they just repaid the separate property. That was obviously the intention. Where it gets muddied is if you took $20,000 out and then 6 months later, you put 10,000 in, another 6 months later, you put 15,000 in, where it's not that clear in out, that argument gets harder and harder to make.
Don't you think, Beth, it gets harder to make too, if you pull that money out, park it in a joint account, and then try to bring it back in.
Right.
Is it still separate, or now have you tainted the whole thing?
Absolutely. And that's where my tracings that I have spreadsheets that are linked to 6 different bank accounts and I'm tracking the percentages and trying to find all that. That's where it starts to get really complicated especially because as we've mentioned a couple times already, we have some very specific cases in Georgia that say as soon as you title something jointly, the presumption is that it's marital. So if it's in a bank account for a day or 10 years, if it's jointly titled, it's presumed to be marital. So we have to see if we can make an argument otherwise, or if it makes sense otherwise. We get nuanced in our language. We talk about source of funds rather than separate, which really mean the same thing. But as you pointed out at the very beginning, separate is more of a legal conclusion, whereas source of funds, we've nuanced into this more accounting term.